aggression, violence, warfare. What is the difference? So a lot of times we use these terms interchangeably, or people tend to just throw them together in a way, but we actually need to think about them slightly differently or define them in a way. Aggression refers to any time someone intentionally or maybe sometimes unintentionally tries to do someone harm, or maybe thinks about doing someone harm. Popular term that's come into effect, which I don't always know what it means, is when someone is passive aggressive. You ever had that happen to you? Being all passive aggressive. So it can mean you're not actively doing somebody harm, you're just being mean. Then there's, of course, violence, when you actually have now started to engage in doing somebody harm. That's when you're actually hurting somebody. Now, a lot of people, again, interchange violence and warfare, but in anthropology, we want to be quite clear that interpersonal violence, like when one person hurts another, is not the same as warfare. So we see violence in lots of different societies and lots of places among different animals. But warfare refers to when people are organized in their violence. And so you have to be getting together and forming a group and going out to hurt another group. So that's different than the idea of aggression or violence. Humans seem to be, we can't ask other creatures why they do these things, but humans seem to be the only creatures, species, who engage in these kinds of behavior, I want to say just because we feel like it, just for reasons that are not related to food or a mate or something physical in your environment. We sometimes engage in this behavior for symbolic reasons. It's not because we don't like someone, not because they're taking our stuff. We just end up not liking them, and maybe we had a fight, a totally verbal fight, and then it's turning into something more than that. And so this is unique. When most other animals are fighting with each other or other animals, it's pretty obvious what they're fighting over. But humans might be fighting over nothing, like a line in the sand or a line on a map. Go fight for it. Why? Hard to say. No, we do wonder, well, how did we get that way? So the other question is, well, what about other primates? We definitely, or what about the non-human primates? We do see these things across other animals that are sometimes aggressive and violent to each other or to other species, obviously. Among other primates, we do observe aggression and sometimes violence. But in general, what we do not observe is what we call coalitionary aggression, where a group is getting together and fighting another group. Except there was one time, or maybe more along, what happened? Chimpanzees have done this. So we have observed, I remember when we were talking about chimpanzees and then those bonobos that tended to have more sex with each other. So we haven't observed this among bonobos, but we have observed this coalition aggression among chimpanzees. They will set up territorial type patrols and walk around their territory, or in some cases, venture into each other's territory, and it looks more like what we would call war. In general, though, again, this is not because they just started not liking the lighter colored chimpanzees. It's generally focused on resources, food, or getting a mate, or again, defending a territory. I will say here that the time that this was most observed, in the case that they talk about in the textbook, whereas Jane Goodall's research in Gombe in Tanzania, and she was one of the first people to study chimpanzees, and she's made incredible contributions to primatology and the study of chimpanzees, as well as being an ambassador for their life. But this was the 1960s and early 70s when she set out to do this, and they really weren't, how to say, they basically lured the chimpanzees into camp by giving them food and other things, and then they started studying them. And so the chimpanzees that she was studying were very used to having humans around. And in fact, if you look at some of her early footage, they actually took things like one of them got a hold of an empty gas can and was rolling it down a hill to make a lot of noise. And the film's like, yeah, and so rose in the rank of chimpanzees because he figured out how to roll this gas can down a hill. And so what I'm saying is that these chimpanzees had their whole social hierarchy changed by their association with human beings. And so when this coalitionary violence was observed, in my opinion, I always take it with a grain of salt. This is not something that we see that much in more wild settings, you might say. And even in those settings, these are settings that have often been where their territory has been reduced by human encroachment. And so probably before there were so many humans around, the chimpanzees may not have engaged in such coalitionary violence. But we do see this, we do observe coalitionary aggression among chimpanzees. Now, in terms of when, so I said we need to separate violence from warfare. We have found in the human record or in the record, the fossil record for humans and closely related to humans, people hurting each other, identifying forms of what seems to be violence as early as 800,000 years ago. And so you do see this, but it's pretty sporadic in the archaeological record. There's not a lot of it. It's isolated. There's actually no archaeological evidence for organized warfare before about 13,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't being done, but there's not mass burial sites, for example. There's not a lot of weaponry. There's just not a lot of evidence for people coalitioning together and fighting each other over territory before about 13,000 years ago. So the archaeological evidence tells us that it was first documented around 13,000 years ago. And then there's a fairly dramatic increase around 7,000 years ago. Now, actually, this is a good exam review question because it asks you to think about what we've been talking about in this unit. What might have happened around 13,000 years ago and then around 7,000 years ago that might have led to or increased or been associated with people fighting each other more intensively? Warfare. Like I said, we don't see this much before about 13,000 years ago. Yeah, Leah. Weapons. Well, we do see weapons or things that could be used as weapons from quite a while ago. You remember all those things that people were using to hunt, and those things show up 50,000, 100,000 years ago. There were definitely things that you could have used to hurt other people long before this, but you're getting there. You're getting closer. Yeah, Colin. Not like early civilizations. Yeah, I'm a little touchy with the word civilization, but I'll give that to you. Yeah, we have the emergence of agriculture. People start domesticating. And before this, you don't have much. People are hunting and gathering. They have weapons, but hunters and gatherers notoriously don't like violence, actually, human to human. And so the hunters and gatherers that you really don't see much evidence of interpersonal violence and hardly any evidence of group warfare. If you're a hunter-gatherer and somebody moves in, you either accept them into your group, or if more people move in, you just move away. But with agriculture, and then especially with the settlement of different societies where they're marking out a territory and saying that this is mine and not yours, and defending that territory, then you have these more big weapons appear, and people start to think that their land and their territory is the most important thing to depend upon. Now, I just want to emphasize this because a lot of people think that warfare goes back millions of years. Actually, warfare doesn't go back that long. It's not very deep in the human record in terms of our evolution. Our textbook also asks, well, why do we have human warfare? And those who've talked about humans are very cooperative. We live in groups, we're very social. So that's one of the reasons we're so great and we spread out all over the world. And as we also talked about, we have very complicated social groups. So we talked about different political ways that we organize, and bands and tribes, chiefdoms and states, and the political complexities of living in these groups. Most of the time, as human beings, for the most part, most people like to follow the norms. They like to fit in. They like to live in harmony with their group, which most of the time is a great thing. Everybody likes to fit in, be a nice person, but it can sometimes lead to warfare. One group thinks that their own group is being threatened. And so in order to fit in, then you go along with the people who are getting violent toward another people. So the same impulse to cooperate and work together can sometimes lead to people working together to fight each other. Again, though, I want to emphasize that this is not very deep in the human record. It's not forever. And there's something else that happens, which is, well, Leah, can people change? Yeah. So we see in various societies that people sometimes their society can get very violent, but then can get more peaceful and then shift back to violent. So again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is this is not something that we observe at the same levels in every society, and it's not something that we observe at the same levels over time. So Leah told us in the Warani, you have people at one point in time exhibiting very high rates of interpersonal violence and then shifting their tactics and kind of giving that up and becoming much more peaceful, directing their protests elsewhere. Textbook talks about how are people encouraged to do things like go to war with another group or try to destroy another group within their society. So one of the things they talk about is just the use of rhetoric, how people talk to each other, maybe use the means of communication to talk about other people. So being able to use political speech or things like radio and television in the modern age to transmit rhetoric. And that rhetoric often, or when this starts to happen, begins to do what we call dehumanizes other people. So instead of emphasizing that people are people, and start to talk about people differently. How do we do that? Yeah, so metaphors. I would say whenever somebody talks about another person or another group of people and starts using words, some of them are obvious. Somebody's comparing a person to a rat, but anytime somebody says, oh, they're animals, you just have to just step back and say, wait a second here. Why is somebody asking me to think of another person as not human, as an animal? Or we get more extreme as a rat or as some vermin. So whenever that happens, be careful. Yeah, and in some cases, when people develop this group identity and then get this sense of threat, like somebody else is about to hurt us, and the rhetoric builds up on the radio and the television, these metaphors of those other people not being even people. They're criminal animals. They're illegals coming in to take my stuff, take my job, kill my kids. It's not that people aren't violent to each other, but you just have to watch out whenever anybody's asking you to perceive other people as a threat or using these kinds of metaphors. These are the things that historically have been associated with extreme violence and things like genocide. So if you don't want to do that, just be aware. Again, you don't want people to have criminals walking around all the time, but just watch out when these metaphors get zapped up like this. One of the other interesting factors of aggression and violence is that most of the time and across the primate groups, this is usually men or males in terms of primates. And so people have asked about, well, why is it mostly men who are involved in these things? And again, I would say that this is not something that is inbuilt in men, but for human beings, it can be a way of forming an identity, of gaining increased social status, and of course, the ideology of, or the rhetoric of being in a military organization. But it doesn't necessarily come, again, even for men, to get people to the point that they are willing to march out and inflict violence on other people. That often requires years of training. Part of what the military does in, say, basic training is not just teach you how to do push-ups, but to try to break down some of your normal, what you might call your normal behaviors, and get you to be able to do what you're required to do to be in the military. And so it doesn't, what I'm saying is some people take to it more than others. There's varying levels, but it doesn't seem to be something that people just join the military and then all of a sudden it's a process. And the people that come back from warfare, well, what happens to people who come back from doing these things, even if they're in a society that values that? Yeah. So it's just, for me, is we often hear that men are naturally violent or something like this, but even for those people who have gone through the training and engaged in these activities, they often come back deeply shaken, traumatized by this. And so it's not something that, like, you really have to get humans to do this in a way to get them to. I'm not saying people haven't been very bad to each other over time, but it does involve it's not necessarily natural to the human condition to do these things. The textbook also mentions something that might seem strange at first, the idea of structural violence. So by the notion of structural violence, we usually think of violence as, somebody hurting each other or physical aggression. What anthropologists and other social science have talked about is the way in which society might be structured so that there is power differential, which results in people actually being harmed, but it's not necessarily that somebody's pointing a gun at your head. And so it might be expressed as, well, people are getting sick and dying much more than other people. And so it's not that anybody has done this. I haven't had to hurt anybody to make this happen, but society is structured in such a way that some people have more resources or healthcare or these kinds of things. And so there are differential rates of violence, but it's not necessarily being done explicitly by someone to another. It might help to give us an example of this. Your textbook talks about what is called settler colonialism, where a group of people from the outside will come into another society and then try to take over their territory and take over their states. And for example, in the United States and in Canada, throughout the 19th and up into the 20th century, I think up until about the 1950s, actually, and also in Australia, this happened. What would happen is people would remove the children of indigenous or Native American communities and take them to be educated in boarding schools. And so I'm sure that at least some of those people they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were giving people an education, bringing them civilization, you might say, to people who needed it. But the results of it were in some ways a form of structural violence. In part because what happens when you remove the children and put them in boarding schools. Yeah, I think we talked about this when we were talking about linguistic anthropology a long time ago. It was ironic, might not be the right word, but there was this idea that we should be preserving other indigenous languages and recording them at the same time that people had this policy of basically taking the kids out of the Native American communities and putting them in places and saying, hey, only speak English here. And so, yeah, it results in this, in what your textbook calls an ongoing coloniality. The colonial relationship is already over, but it continues to perpetuate into the present. And so there's this ongoing trauma of what has happened from this period that many indigenous or Native American peoples still feel today in terms of their relationship to places like the United States and Canada. And some of these things are only now coming out, where people are discovering graves of children and that were abused in these situations. So this is an example that there may have been actual violence, but the structure of society works in such a way where violence is visited upon one group differentially in a certain time period. All right.